Aaron Ingram.
Sick.
Thanks for coming on, man. Appreciate it.
Me.
Yeah. So, we kind of start each episode talking about, number one, what you're doing now, and then kind of your journey to get there. What was your plan after high school, and then kind of how you got to what you're doing now. And then we'll talk kind of specifically about your expertise and kind of what you're seeing going on in the market.
Okay. So I am the owner of Valuation Services now. I grew up in Valparaiso. My dad worked on the railroad and moved to Chicago, so we moved up here when I was 4. While he was doing that, he started selling real estate. And then later he got into real estate appraisals. Back then you didn't need a real estate appraiser license. You could do it with a broker's license. So he started doing that.
So does that mean, like, if you were like a real estate agent, you could also do appraisals?
Yeah,
okay.
They weren't as regulated as they are now. So he started doing that. Eventually he became a full-time real estate appraiser. Joined Valuation Services in the early 1990s. And then eventually bought the company off the original owner. I went to IU Bloomington after college or after high school. I had thought about becoming an appraiser. I took a lot of business economics classes. Yeah. I was, working at the mall at Hollister.
Nice. You look like you should work at a Hollister.
Yeah, right. And then after my freshman year, I moved in with my aunt in Indianapolis for 3 weeks. Took all my trainee classes and started doing appraisals. So that would be 2003, 2004. Market was really busy, a lot of new construction going on. So I would come home once a month, twice a month, and do some appraisals on the weekend. Then when you're doing vacant lots, I didn't need to set appointments. Go do my inspections, work up a couple of reports, and I was making a lot more doing that than I was at Hollister. Eventually, I just kept doing that, making more money, so decided to move back after my junior year and do that full time. Finished up at Indiana Northwest.
Okay.
And started doing appraisals. Did mostly residential to start, moved into commercial, and just gradually, started to learn the business, the properties, the markets, and bought the company maybe 5 years ago from my dad. So he still works for me. He still gets assigned a lot of court work, helps me out with a lot of things. He kind of does handyman stuff around the office, works his court cases.
What do you mean by court cases?
So a lot of times we'll be assigned by a judge, a court, to appraise property, in maybe a condemnation situation. So, if some governmental agency wants to acquire property, a judge will assign 3 people to value it, usually 2 appraisers and then a freeholder, a property owner in the area. Sometimes they are agents, appraisers. Sometimes they're just citizens. So we'll get assigned a property and then have to work through it.
Yeah, so going back to college, you're getting started doing appraisals. So I have another acquaintance of mine that does residential appraisal. It's like the same thing. Isn't there like a 2-year apprenticeship kind of thing? You have to work under another appraiser?
Yeah, so after you get your trainee license, which is, I think, 90 or around thereabouts hours of classroom education, tests, that sort of thing, then you are required to do a 2,000-hour mentorship trainee program. So they give you a minimum. You have to do 2 years of that, but some people just take more, whether they're working full-time. The 2,000 hours have to be hours spent doing appraisals, and then you have to be receiving credit for that work.
How is that like audited? So it's like you can go, is there like an allotment of time for like a certain appraisal? Like, oh, you did this appraisal, we assume it's like 10 hours of time, or?
It's actual time. So if you spend 3 hours working on an appraisal in some capacity where you're credited, you have to be, in the appraisal report. Then you have a log, and that gets submitted to the state when you do your license upgrade, and they will ask for copies of some of those reports, and then take a look at that work.
So you're in college, you're studying economics and business, me as well. You're doing that. Did you always just kind of with your dad doing real estate, like enjoy that side?
Yeah.
Is it the number side? Is it the strategy side? Like, what do you really enjoy about that business?
Every day is different. So, every real estate appraisal is a problem.
Yeah.
And every property is different. Even one house from the other in the same subdivision could be different. So, it's constantly creative thinking. It's never the same thing. You're meeting people, go out and look at properties, and then, work through that problem.
Yeah.
So we're not always searching for the market value today.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's the market value as of a past date. Sometimes it's the true tax value or a use value. I just did an appraisal that was like the retrospective date was 15 years ago. So, it's a different, each individual report is a different problem. And I enjoy the creative thinking process. So
that's awesome. So you start working for your dad. I assume he had other appraisers at that time?
Yeah.
How were you received being the your dad being the owner? Because I know from my experience, I typically was received pretty well, but sometimes not so well. And then they saw how I was treated compared to the other employees, and they're like, "All right, we don't, we understand that you're not getting as good of a as dealt as good a hand as we thought." But how was that for you? And then kind of how'd you overcome that kind of working?
I think everyone was great. I mean, I'm sure I got some special treatment, but I also that probably went the other way sometimes too.
Yeah.
But I think, there were times when I wanted to, show that I was doing a little bit more. So, I have now I have my MAI and SRA.
Can you explain? Can you say what those are?
So they're not acronyms anymore. They used to be. They used to be member of the Appraisal Institute and a senior residential appraiser. They're not anymore. It's just MAI and SRA.
Yeah.
But those mean that I've become a member of the Appraisal Institute, taken additional classes, additional testing, and had my work audited and reviewed by other appraisers around the country. So with both of those, kind of a above and beyond the state certification process.
Yeah, I think more than anything, like someone's work ethic is going to earn them like that respect in the office, whether your dad is the owner or not. And from our experience of knowing each other, like you work your butt off like all the time, staying on top of stuff. So I've always really appreciated that about your hustle. So you get into it 2004, right? Really good 3-year string from 2004 to 2007. Can you talk, as being somebody who was super, super involved in real estate, like what was that like for you? And maybe like the feel even in the office of like when the housing crisis started, and how'd that kind of affect your life?
Well, we knew, that the prices were going up, that every new house seemed to be setting a record for that market. You just had neighborhoods where no house had ever sold for more than X, and now all of a sudden every house is there, and they're starting to go to that next barrier, and you're going out and seeing people, and it's just, is this, this young couple, and they have this job, they're buying this house. It is just, you could start to see, whereas, maybe there's some situation for one person, but when everyone you go meet seems to have a job that wouldn't necessarily denote that level of home.
Yeah.
You could see something was up. Everything was setting a record, and when you're doing an appraisal, we forecast market conditions, but the information we use is sales. So we're using past information, and that doesn't mean we can never forecast a sales increase, but anytime you're extrapolating outside of your data range, you're on a more uncertain ground than when you're inside your data range.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of pressure from lenders, a lot of pressure from people to do that. And you could, then you started to see the cracks and, I did a little work for the Attorney General at points in there, and you could see fraud.
Oh, wow.
So, we could see it, but, just didn't know when or how it would happen.
So yeah, I think that was like it seemed like there was a lot more people that knew it was going to crash eventually. I mean, they didn't know like the actual intricacies of like how big it was. Like, I'm sure you've watched that movie, The Big Short.
Yeah.
It's like one of my favorite movies. But so you're saying that you could kind of feel that like, okay, this is not sustainable, like long term.
Yeah. You would just see, you could see that data, that line going up.
Yeah.
And it has to be finite. The growth has to be, right?
Yeah.
So from our point, it got to where each new number, we'd be forecasting that market conditions adjustment to say, all right, this house sold for this in this neighborhood last month. Can this one really be this much more?
Yeah.
And you could start to see where it was getting shakier. I didn't understand the full, bundling and subprime and all of that. Yeah. But we could see that there were probably some borrowers that had bigger houses than they probably should have. And,
yeah.
You'd see that ever increasing number didn't seem like it could be a permanent change.
Yeah. So 2008 happens, housing crisis, affecting your business. Like, let's say, you're at 100%. What kind of decrease did you see in business after that, or of any?
There was definitely a decrease. I don't know if I could tell you the number, maybe a quarter to a third. So our business, and we've intentionally built it to not be reliant on lending.
Yeah.
So we work with municipalities, work with owners' values for divorces, estates, tax issues. So we've always tried to have a varied, supply of work. And then the 2008 crash sort of happened quick enough that then, we do work on the other side too, in the bank-owned properties where they needed to know what the property was worth now. They had a loan on it, when the borrower got it 2 years ago, and now they're taking it back. Maybe it's damaged. Maybe, something's happened. The market has changed. Where can they unload it at? What's their point?
So that's amazing. Like, was that reactionary in the time, or were you guys just doing that even previous to that? And then was that like a pre-thought of, we don't want to have all of our eggs in the lending basket, we need to diversify because we know that this could change pretty rapidly?
Well, I don't know. It was not done in response to the 2007 run-up. It was something we had always tried to do. We've always tried to work with municipalities and governmental agencies, nonprofits, attorneys, just because it's a different work and there's always more pressure on fees from lenders, and turn times. They want to pay as little as possible and have the work done as quick as possible.
Yeah.
Whereas, municipalities have longer time frames, and a lot of attorneys are looking for quality. They're not interested really in the price. Their client is paying, but they want to make sure that they, go to court or go to a negotiation table with the best product available. So,
yeah, and that makes sense. So, sounds like business still stayed healthy after.
It was slower. I mean, there was definitely some, leaner years, and for my parents there were difficulties, I'm sure, but they kept it together, and they've always had a really great work ethic and, mentality. So,
yeah, I think there's so much in like when things are really, really good, people seem to think like they're always going to be that way.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's the people who are kind of like, hey, things are good, but like, anything can happen, and just the way that you diversify to prepare for when that happens. Cause it's really hard when everyone's stopping and turning at the same time to get ahead. It's better to be already kind of in that lane going in that direction. That's amazing. So like, right now, so you talked about 5 years ago, you bought the business from your father, and how that works. How's your relationship with your dad, like working together? Because I've been in that boat, and it's enjoyable because you're your family, but there's also like stresses. Like you do things a little bit differently. But
no, I mean, it's awesome. He's never. I can't think of a time where he said, this is how we did it before, and we think you should do that. It's, do your thing. It's, it's your business. He comes in. Our new office is literally across the street from his house. Yeah. He comes in, works, and it's honestly awesome. He's a fantastic coworker. He's really helpful. A lot of times, I'm just, showing him something and saying, does this make sense? Like, what's your thoughts, or can you read this? Give me your opinion, and he does it, without ever, any question or criticism. Just, he's fantastic.
Yeah. What, like watching your dad and working with him those years, just can you give like a couple of examples of just things he did as a leader you really appreciated? Maybe some characteristics he had.
I mean, I think, the phrase servant leadership gets tossed around, and everybody's a servant leader and all that. But, my dad would, he would work, and he was, for a long time, the most valuable appraiser in the office. But he would also be the one painting or cutting the yard or, doing the chores around the house. He did everything he could to make the workplace better, to help people. He would be, very literally the first to arrive, last to leave type of person. And I think, I don't ever remember a pep talk or a worded memo or something, but it was just a work ethic and a deference, to maybe, people that worked for him, but, he was very quick to show that he worked for them too.
Yeah.
That he would do anything he could to help them. So,
yeah, I think that's kind of the glue too. Like if you have someone that's there, and like even if they are the most valuable, like making you feel like, oh, like he's there to make me valuable too, and to make me better. I think that's a really important aspect too. So you buy the business, and I love real estate. I think I would call them like people who are like TikTok, like real estate investors who are like, oh, only put 2% down and cash flow, refinance. What I kind of wanted to hear from you is you kind of see both sides, right? You see the buying, you see the refinancing and everything else. What are some things you see from people who are really good at real estate that they do? And then what are some things that you see people who are like, I would call them fly-by-nighter real estate people? Like what are some things people like, hey, these are good real estate principles, and then these are bad real estate principles?
I mean, I think the good real estate investors I know, understand time, not just time holding real estate, but time when you have real estate that's not generating cash flow. If you flip a house, the people who understand how to move quickly, how to have the resources available to move quickly and to hold a property. Yeah. Those people do well. I think, I think it's really understanding time. If you have a vacant property or you have a property that you're holding into, a slower season of the market, that is going to be an expensive proposition. We always say, it costs something like a 1% to hold the house every month. So if you have a flip going and, it takes 9 months instead of 4, you've lost 5% maybe. And so the people who understand that, and then those people all seem to understand, time from the sense that holding a sunk cost isn't a good use of their time, to cut bait and, move on to the next project.
Kind of swallowing their pride, like, hey, got in on this one, didn't work out how I wanted.
This was whatever, and be done with it, not sink more time into it. I know investors that only buy in cash and have long hold times that are successful. I know guys that, borrow to the max and, move from one deal to another that are successful. I think you can do either. A lot of the BRRRR, the buy, renovate, refinance, whatever, rent, refinance. A lot of those guys can be really successful. That's a different, you have to have that mindset. You have to have the cash flow mindset, the understanding the lending aspect to, to have control of all the balls you have in the air, essentially, and be able to manage them. And then, there's other guys that are real successful and they pay cash for everything and have a much longer holding length. And, that's a fantastic way to do it. It's a different type of risk, but, and it's a different type of reward too. You're going to be probably slower to accumulate, all the doors or whatever, the TikTokers say, but, there's certainly people who are extremely wealthy and extremely successful that do that.
Yeah, I just recently was watching a video, and I forget who the person was that quoted it. They say, when the tide goes out, you can always tell who's skinny dipping.
Yeah.
Right? And it's kind of like in real estate, right? 2008, the people who were liquid and could do exactly what you're talking about, time. Like, hey, I can sit on this, or I don't have to sell or lose. They survived. But the people who were extremely leveraged and, weren't planning for a downturn like that can't make it. And like, that's like, I really appreciate, I have a good friend who I really appreciate his real estate, what he likes to do. Because for him is like all about like, I just want to be able to sleep at night. I don't have to worry about like, oh, I got to cover a $10,000 bill, like a payment for my building, and I only got $8,000 in the bank, something like that. And that's kind of how I've taken my stance with my stuff is like, number one, I want to self-occupy it, for me. So it's like, I want to self-occupy it. And then I want to, my actual goal is I want to have an 8-year payoff period. So it's like, hey, whatever my self-occupancy is and whatever like the going rate is, based on market, I want to be able to pay it off in 8 years. And if that means I can't buy a building for a while, that's okay. But I can sleep at night doing that.
Yeah.
It's like I can kind of see a little bit into the future and know that, hey, if I had to sell it, if I got into a bad place, I could do that. I don't have to do something tomorrow. But I think that's like a point. Like, I think we're going to see a lot of the skinny dippers here in the next probably 2 years.
Yeah, I think that's very possible. A lot of the, these cash flow assumptions from the last few years were built on being able to refinance with equity at low rates. And if that's no longer the case, I think we are going to see that. So, lenders had learned a lot after 2008. We saw a lot of practices change. I think no matter what, the lending landscape is in much better shape than then. We don't see development loans for entire subdivisions anymore. Everything is done in phases. A lot of the developers are buying smaller pieces of land and then optioning the pieces around them so that they're not sitting on hundreds of acres. They're sitting on, on 100 acres with the ability to add later if they need to. But from a lending perspective, a lot of our developments are smaller in phases again.
Yeah.
Where, the lenders are saying, yeah, let's get the first quarter up. Let's get the first half up. And, if that's doing well, then we'll keep going.
So does that mean when you say they're cutting it up, does that mean like, hey, a developer or somebody owns 100 acres and like, hey, let's develop the first 25 acres of that? Is that more of what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. So,
okay.
In 2006 and 7, you would see these developers and they would do the whole subdivision in one shot. They'd buy all the land, put in all the infrastructure, all the amenities now. And now we're seeing them, buy that first chunk of land, put options on the rest, and then, do smaller.
Yeah, I remember that they definitely have tightened down on who they give mortgages to, because 2018, like I applied for a mortgage and the only W-2 I've ever had is either when I worked for my dad when I was like 18 or whatever, and then the military. And then I've only been self-employed since college. And they're like, well, you don't have a W-2. Like I got turned down multiple times. And I'm like, guys, you just gave like 3 of my employees mortgages. You won't give me. I'm the one paying, their salaries. And eventually I kind of explained, and I was able to have enough money to put cash down. I owned my first home cash. But they definitely tightened down where it is pretty rigid, I feel like, even to the point where it doesn't even make sense sometimes.
Yeah. And that is, definitely a circumstance of that 15 years ago. And there's always going to be situations, like in your case where you have a different ways to qualify. But now that we've seen Silicon Valley and First Republic collapse, those were the banks that were doing that the most. They were the people who were, funding startup mortgages.
Yeah.
So, we'll see. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the government sponsored entities have a monopoly on loans, and they're deciding a lot of the housing the housing guidelines, and picking those eligible people.
Yeah. So going to like commercial real estate appraising, kind of over your years, can you talk a little bit from your experience of, hey, like these are the buildings that I see on average are more risky, these kinds of commercial real estate, and then these are ones that I see that typically actually perform well and have a good longevity?
Yeah, real estate is not unlike most investments where, risk and reward are intertwined. So, in markets that don't have a lot of investors is where you're going to see the highest rewards. Traditionally in our market, that's been your North Lake County, and that's been your more rural counties. You don't have a ton of professional investors working in those areas.
Yeah.
Smaller deals, a lot of larger investors just aren't interested below a certain price point. There's not enough return there, for their time. So the lower priced markets, the older asset classes, the markets that don't have a lot of traditional real estate investors is always going to be, a place where you have the highest reward.
Yeah.
It's a higher risk, but that's what I would say. Our safest markets are going to be those with investors.
Yeah.
Northwest Indiana has not seen a ton of institutional investment. The California Teachers Pension Fund is not actively buying in Northwest Indiana. It had, BlackRock, those sort of things haven't been actively buying a lot. Some of that is changing. We're starting to see more institutional investment in our better properties throughout Northwest Indiana, which is a lower return. Their cost of capital is lower. Their expected returns are lower. They're looking for safe cash flow generating investments, usually for a long term. Short term investments in markets without that type of investor is where you're always going to see your highest return here.
So looking at the different like classes, right? Like looking at like retail, strip malls, your traditional mall, storage warehouses, office buildings. Out of those, which ones do you see kind of like, hey, these are the ones that struggle pretty consistently, and which ones do you see like these are really good long-term hold?
Low quality retail is always something that'll struggle. Your sort of class C strip retail, unanchored, usually struggles with vacancy, usually struggles to get tenants into a lease where the tenant is paying for common expenses, taxes, or insurance. If you go by your Chipotle, Verizon type strip centers, in those cases, you have leases where the tenants are paying their share.
Yeah.
So if your tax bill goes up, insurance happens, there's something with damage to the building, the landlord's return is pretty well locked in. They're getting a triple. We call them triple net leases. In your lower asset classes, you're not seeing sophisticated tenants. They're not going to be picking up their pro rata share of expenses. They're going to be much more in like what we call a gross lease situation, where they're paying X a month that covers all their costs. They may do their own insurance or something, but there's more risk to the landlord there. Where I just looked at a property today and their tax bill tripled. Something changed in their assessment, and now they're going to have to find a way to do that. And if they're in a lease, if the building's leased, they don't have a way to pass that on.
Yeah, I got you. So basically, like you're kind of rolling the dice on what's going to happen in the future, because that would be hard. I mean, even like looking at your asphalt, right? Like you're like, oh, I got to replace this in 15 years, and like when you're going into buying a building, let's say someone who is just getting into commercial real estate. Like, what are like a few things you'd be like, hey, you need to look out for these things? Like, maybe it's how old is the asphalt? How old is the roof? Like, what are those things that like sneakily can like really get you underwater?
Yeah.
You're not looking at.
People drastically underestimate costs in commercial buildings for what I've seen. Parking lots, like you're saying, asphalt, roofing, and HVAC. If your frame of reference is your home, and you're trying to, extrapolate that to a commercial building, it's probably not there. So that's a number, people tell me things, I'm going to replace this for this. And it's like, no, it's going to be 5 times that at minimum. So, I think if you're buying your first property and, it pays to have an inspector look at it to get an idea of what those costs are up front.
Yeah.
And then to get an idea of when you're going to need to pay them, to get a roofer out and say, you got 5 or 7 years left. And when you do, it's going to be this much money. So, think about putting money away into a sinking fund. Think about, putting your tenants into a situation where they're going to be responsible for some of those costs.
Yeah, and that might mean, a lot of times that means you're sacrificing a higher rent rate, but you're alleviating your risk on the back end.
Yeah, so, that risk and reward thing, in commercial real estate, we use a capitalization rate mostly for properties around here. And what a capitalization rate is the inverse of your income multiplier.
Yeah.
So your net income divided by your property is your cap rate. So on a property with a triple net lease, a tenant that is almost certainly going to pay, something corporate guaranteed, something with a Verizon, a Chipotle, a Starbucks, those sort of places, your returns are going to be very low.
Yeah.
Those properties are trading in the 4 and 5% cap rates, meaning, you're looking at 20 to 25 years on a payback, from your net income. But that money, the risk on that money is very low. You're looking at long-term leases. You're looking at triple net leases where, you get a tax bill and just forward it along to their real estate department who, is required to, write that check. Some of those investments, you don't have any more rights than the next person to go into that building. If you own a CVS or something, you can't go back and inspect the pharmacy thing. You don't get 10% off a tube of toothpaste, but you get a check every month. They pay the taxes. They're contracting and handling snow removal and light bulbs and everything else that goes with it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, it seems like, you're not making as high returns. And that's the big thing with real estate. If you're getting into real estate to make money really, really fast, it's bound to really burn you eventually. But it seems like what you're saying is like you got to really look at those long-term gains and your long-term risks with that too.
Yeah, real estate, even if you have something that's fairly liquid, even if you have a duplex or a fourplex or something, you're still almost always 30 days out with cost to sell. It's not like my Robinhood app where I can unload a position and instantly have the credit. You're almost always sometime out, especially if you want to get the best deal.
Yeah.
You can fire sale stuff and have your money in a couple of weeks, but it's the time frame for getting rich quick is different than it would be if you're trading options or cryptocurrency or something.
Exactly. So 5 years ago, buy the business off your dad. Over like the last 5 years, what are like some things that you have done to like better yourself as like a leader? Like what are some things that you focus on in your office to build your staff up and to, kind of encourage and make them more efficient?
Well, I mean, from the efficiency standpoint, we've really worked on the technology side. When I bought the company, we were working with, a Microsoft Excel and Word template that had no macros to it. It was someone was individually merging those documents. We were writing and filling in the blanks, per property.
Yeah.
If we did a property in East Chicago, we'd look up and write about East Chicago. And, maybe we'd save that for the next report, but it would need updated each time. Mm-hmm. Our comp database was printed off sheets and binders. We were starting to get some of that where we could edit it and insert it into the report. But, leveraging technology has really helped us become more efficient. When we were typing those reports, it was really hard to find someone to type reports. It took a very long time to train them. In a commercial appraisal report, there's a lot more variability than in a residential appraisal report. In a residential appraisal report, most homes are, valued and valuable because of similar features.
Yeah.
There's a sliding scale of quality, of condition, of size, but in that framework is relatively rigid.
Yeah.
Most homes in the, market fits a pretty narrow set of parameters.
Yeah.
With a commercial property, you have much more variability, not only in size, but in what's important to people. If you're working on an auto repair facility, the number of garages is important. With office, an office building, you're looking at the amount of rentable office space versus, a property that has a lot of common area that's not really as valuable. Retail, completely different thing. You're looking at traffic count and income statistics for people within a certain, driving distance or radius. So every property type has different features. And then, even among those property types, you're going to have features that are more important. So writing a commercial appraisal report for an oil change facility one day and then an office building the next, was a completely different report. And it took a long time to get those people where they could do it. And now, we've leveraged some technology to make that go a little quicker, to automatically pull in our city statistics, to automatically pull in our comparable sales, to be able to sort them and graph them based on, the different characteristics that are important.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to talk about too is you guys do more than just the appraisal stuff, because I think I saw like a post you guys do, like anytime you get like a new valuation for your home, you'll like look it over and see if like the new tax basis is correct, right?
Yeah. So, we when you're working for lenders, the only thing you're almost always interested in is the market value as of an effective date under FIREA guidelines.
Okay.
So that is one set of parameters that you're bound by, and there's things you can and cannot do or have to do inside those parameters. But part of the appraisal training and profession is providing different numbers, providing numbers based on hypothetical scenarios or numbers extraordinary assumptions, meaning, what would it be if this happened?
Yeah.
Or in the case of like assessments, that's a true tax value as defined by Indiana law, which is much more of like a market value in use, which is how Indiana taxes their property, in a way that they've designed to be more just to homeowners. So yeah, that is something we do. So we'll look at that true tax value, and that has a different effective date and, some parameters that the assessors and assessment officials have chosen.
Yeah. The one thing I did want to talk about, obviously now 22 to 23, those crazy historically low rates gone. We have new rates, and what I think what a lot of people don't realize is in commercial real estate, you don't typically have a fixed loan rate, and it's typically based. I don't know. I know I've heard it's like a Wall Street Journal or some sort of like rate that's like set. So it's like people are like, oh yeah, I pay. I got my building at 4%, but then after it's like fixed for a certain period of time, then it balloons.
Yeah.
So can you see that like causing any issues in the next few years?
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, most commercial loans are on a 5-year term with a balloon, and then you would refinance that balloon down the line. They may have a 25 or 20 or 30 year amortization, like your typical residential mortgage, but you don't get to keep that for 30 years.
Yeah.
So, I think down the line in 2, 3, 4 years, we're going to see some people who are now looking at a different monthly payment, one that might be higher, with the increase in the rates that could affect the, one thing lenders look at is debt covered, debt service coverage ratio. They want that property to be able to generate enough money to pay for itself and more.
Yeah.
It's not in their best interest for that property to only work for them. They want it to work for the owner so that he's going to continue maintaining it and increasing his stake in it. So down the line, that could be a problem.
So does that mean like a bank could come to somebody and be like, hey, you initially put this amount down based on this rate for your cash flow projections. Now that the rate's going up to this, we actually need you to put in an extra $50K so that it's generating enough like long term based on this rate. Is that what that means to call in on a loan?
I mean, that would be when you go to refinance.
Okay.
That process is going to start, and the bank's going to say, hey, your balloon is up. Let's refinance this, and they're going to take a look at that deal again. And, something else with commercial mortgages, unlike residential mortgages, is that the bank stays fairly involved with you and your property throughout the life. You can get a residential mortgage, and if you don't ever miss a payment, you're not going to hear from your lender at all.
Yeah.
They're not going to know if you lose your job. They're not going to know if, you decide to stay home, or you win the lottery.
Yeah.
They're not involved in your personal financial life, with the exception of making sure they receive that payment.
Yeah.
With a commercial building, the banks are more involved. Your lender is going to be looking at your financial statements. They a lot of lenders will have you assign rent checks to them.
Wow.
So where instead of you getting that rent check, it goes to them, and they take theirs first. So
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, and in that case, it's kind of easy for you. They're going to handle that, and then but that also means if they don't get a rent check, they're aware of it instantly.
Yeah.
There's no lag there.
Yeah. So basically, can you explain? I mean, I'm going to ask a question, but correct me if I'm wrong in my summary. So basically, when you go to the bank to refinance, they're like, okay, I want to see all of your current leases that you have at the rent rate. And then that's what they're leaning on essentially, is like, hey, well, I want to make sure that all these leases that you say you have, the checks are coming to us. Is that essentially how that works?
Yeah, and they're looking at that cash flow, and they're looking at it now, and they're looking at it in the future too. So one thing a lender is going to want to see is a staggered lease expiration date. If you have a strip center or an office building and all the leases expire at some point, if that point is in a different financial situation, a weaker financial situation than the point they were signed, there's a high likelihood of tenants taking less space or renegotiating or vacating.
Yeah.
So that is a way they're going to mitigate risk is, by spreading it out and not having those large expirations.
Yeah, that makes sense. That way you're like, oh, like something's wrong. Like all of your tenants just leave all at once.
Yeah, something happens, COVID happens or something. If you were trying to re-up an office building in July of 2000, you could be in a problem. And so if you have that spread out, it mitigates that risk.
Yeah. So, your journey, obviously 2023, like each segment I do this. So what is something that you would go back and tell yourself getting started in this career, maybe something that you spent too much time on that, hey, that was not maybe something, and then something you wished you would have spent more time focusing on earlier on in your career?
I guess something I wish I would have done more to get better when I was quicker. I got my MAI and my SRA a little bit later. I wish I would have focused a little more on the real estate stuff in college. Wish I would have invested a little bit more money in real estate earlier.
Yeah.
Looking back, hindsight 2020 and all that, but there's, times where you knew properties were cheap. There are times when I've seen something and said, "That whoever buys that, they'll never regret that." And not taking advantage of all of those is something.
Is it kind of like the paradox of like the construction worker doesn't want to work on his house and the mechanic doesn't want to work on his car, like their own stuff?
No, the cobbler's son has no shoes.
Yeah.
No, I mean I enjoy that, and my dad and I have flipped a couple houses. My wife and I have. We bought a lot recently and sold it. I do enjoy that. It's different. I think kind of the blessing and the curse of being a real estate appraiser is that you see a lot of really good plans fail, and you see a lot of really bad plans succeed, and it kind of gives you a perspective where some ideas don't seem so crazy and some crazy ideas seem good. There's kind of a joke among real estate appraisers that after doctors, real estate appraisers are the worst investors. And part of that is that you get really, really good at the numbers, and it's really, really easy to talk yourself into a scenario where you move this just a little bit and you move this just a little bit, and all of a sudden you've created a deal that's wonderful, but no longer has, if you set every parameter to the best case scenario, even if it's still a possible scenario, it's an unlikely one.
Yeah. That's awesome, man. Well, hey, I appreciate you coming on. Aaron, Valuation Services. And yeah, I kind of want to have you on maybe like a year or so to talk about just even how real estate's changing.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's going to be interesting, I think, to see.
Yeah, the next few years.
Yeah, the housing market. There's been a lot of written about its downfall, and it hasn't happened yet. So
yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see what happens.
It will be. There's just a lot of uncertainty. Feels like everybody's holding their breath. So
yeah,
we'll see.
Awesome, man. Thanks for coming on.
Yep. Thanks for having me.